Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to participate in the webinar. Our intention today is to provide an overview of the insights generated by the Understanding Inequalities research program, specifically to report illustrative findings of our research on inequalities in the exposure to crime and to offending. We hope that the materials we present will stimulate discussion of the nature and extent of these inequalities, how best to measure and explain their manifestation, and how we might seek to bring about their redress. We begin by examining shifting inequality in the exposure to crime at the neighbourhood level. Since the 1990s, and across many developed polities, there has been a dramatic decline in recorded community-based crime. Research examining the crime drop shows that within cities there has been significant variation in absolute crime trends over time at the neighbourhood level. Nevertheless, crime continues to be heavily concentrated in particular places within cities, and inequality in the exposure to crime has been shown to be associated with patterns of deprivation. Measuring absolute crime trends in neighbourhoods without considering their performance in comparison with other neighbourhoods neglects the relational aspect of crime inequality. Relative inequalities matter because they are associated with well-being and a range of social outcomes. In these terms, we were motivated to question whether the crime drop dividend has been shared equally across neighbourhoods, or whether some neighbourhoods had benefited more than others. To facilitate this investigation, we developed a methodology to assess long-term relative inequality in the exposure to crime. In simple terms, we group neighbourhoods into three categories based on their crime trajectories relative to the citywide trend. The first category comprised the winners, neighbourhoods wherein exposure to crime fell at a faster rate than the citywide trend. The second category comprised the losers, neighbourhoods wherein exposure to crime fell at a slower rate or indeed rose in relation to the citywide trend. The third category comprised neighbourhoods wherein exposure to crime aligned with the citywide trend. We applied this methodology to an assessment of both property and violent crime in Birmingham and Glasgow in the period 2007 to 2016. An assessment in which we also took account of neighbourhood deprivation through application of the Townsend Index, which comprises various measures of deprivation. The spatial scale of analysis here is that of lower super output areas, LSOAs, in Birmingham and data zones in Glasgow. These are areas comprising part of the UK census geography, designed to be homogeneous in nature and for which a set of socio-demographic and land use data is regularly collected. LSOAs have a residential population of approximately 1,500 people and data zones approximately 750 people. Before we progress, it is important to note 2 points. First, that the smaller scale of the spatial units in Glasgow might be expected to deliver greater volatility and concentration in exposure to crime. Second, that Glasgow and Birmingham as cities hold comparable deprivation profiles. What can we determine from this analysis? In overview, the least deprived neighbourhoods are most likely to have performed under the crime drop in line with the citywide trend. You can see this by the greater proportion of yellow shaded for the least deprived areas. In contrast, there is greater volatility in performance under the crime drop amongst the most deprived neighbourhoods. This is particularly so for violent crime. 2/3 of the most deprived neighbourhoods in Glasgow and Birmingham perform better or worse than the citywide trend. In Birmingham, we observe a slightly different pattern for property crime, in that the least deprived neighbourhoods appear to have lost out more from the crime drop than the most deprived neighbourhoods. We will return to this issue later. However, and for now, what do these findings imply for the relative inequality in the exposure to crime between the least and most deprived neighbourhoods? Has it widened or narrowed? This slide contrasts absolute and relative trends in the exposure to both property and violent crime over time and between the least and most deprived neighbourhoods. The green lines represent relative trends and the blue lines the absolute trends in exposure. In Glasgow, whether we consider property or violent crime, there has been a narrowing of inequality in absolute exposure between the most and least deprived neighbourhoods. The blue lines, as you can see, move closer together. Yet, inequality in relative exposure to these crimes between the most and least deprived neighbourhoods has widened. As you can see, the green lines move further apart. In Birmingham, a similar pattern for violent crime, the bottom right panel, can be discerned. However, inequality in exposure to property crime in both absolute and relative terms has narrowed over time, the bottom left panel. How then might we account for the greater volatility in performance amongst the most deprived neighbourhoods? And what does this imply for our understanding of crime? One potential explanatory factor is that of the suburbanisation of poverty. In recent years, there has been growing evidence of a suburbanisation or spatial reordering of poverty, involving the dispersal of poorer people away from urban centres in cities across the United Kingdom, Europe and the United States. This shift has been linked to a revitalisation of urban centres, driven by both public-led regeneration and private-led gentrification. Has this impacted on the spatial patterning of crime and on its association with deprivation? Whilst previous research has evidenced that spatially concentrated deprivation holds an association with both property and violent crime, it is important to note that it is not clear whether a causal relationship exists. Moreover, the association between deprivation and crime has been shown to differ, depending on the spatial scale of analysis and on the measures of poverty examined. Our research examined multiple measures of poverty. Here, we focus on income deprivation, defined as those in receipt of welfare benefits and tax credits. Income deprivation has been proposed as heightening the inclination or vulnerability to commit crime or to be a victim of crime. The first task is to assess evidence of the spatial reordering of poverty and of crime. We do so here by presenting the changing share of the income-deprived population and of crime, variance in the crime rates, by distance measured in deciles from the city centre, the central business districts of Glasgow and Birmingham, to the periphery of their travel to work areas. The spatial units within these deciles for which we collated data are, as before, data zones and LSOAs. The top two figures on this slide present evidence of the spatial reordering of poverty, Glasgow on the left, Birmingham on the right. Here, it is evident that both Glasgow and Birmingham have experienced a decline in the share of an income-deprived population in the areas closest to the city centre, and an increase in the share of an income-deprived population in outer urban areas. In Glasgow, this shift has taken place towards the periphery, whereas in Birmingham it is closer to the city centre. Does the spatial reordering of crime mirror these patterns? The findings are depicted in the bottom two figures, Glasgow on the left and Birmingham on the right. In Glasgow, the share of both violent and property crime has declined in the areas closest to the city centre, whilst they have increased in outlying areas. In Birmingham, the share of violent crime has declined in the areas closest to the city centre, and the share of property crime has increased in areas further away from the city centre. In overview, there are similarities, but not an exact match between the shift in the spatial patterning of poverty and of crime. If we progress to examine stability and change in the correlation between income poverty and crime, we find the following. In both Glasgow and Birmingham, the citywide correlation between poverty and violent crime remains strong across the study period, even strengthening, albeit slightly, in Birmingham. However, the correlation between poverty and property crime is modest at the commencement of the study period and further weakens in both Glasgow and Birmingham. How might we account for and interpret these findings? First, the distinction between violent and property crime. Existing research on violent crime in neighbourhoods is suggestive of violence being perpetrated a short distance from where people live, i.e. within their own neighbourhood. In these terms, we should expect a strong association between deprivation and violent crime. In contrast, research on property-related offending is suggestive of a weak spatial association, founded on the fact that offenders victimise neighbourhoods surrounding as well as their own neighbourhood. In these terms, we might expect a weaker association between the level of poverty in a neighbourhood and property crime in that neighbourhood. There are, of course, other factors at play, factors that may have served to confound the association between poverty and property crime, specifically securitisation and the shift in the nature of property crime to online offences. Nevertheless, and taking the findings as a whole, we can see both the suburbanisation of poverty and of crime, but this has not served to substantially reshape the association between poverty and crime. In other words, the suburbanisation of poverty has not served to improve or worsen the lot of the poor. Inequalities in the exposure to crime are seen to persist. In these terms, it remains possible to develop spatial and deprivation-focused interventions in violent crime, whereas property crime-related interventions, given the narrow distinction in exposure across communities, require being deployed either over a greater or at a sharper spatial scale, inclusive of the peripheries of cities. The prevalence of crime in these areas may, in part, have been shaped by the spatial reordering of poverty. To date, we have only examined inequality in exposure to crime using recorded crime data. Our analyses have extended to the use of calls for service data, crime incidents reported by the public to the police. Increasingly, particularly in the United States, research is reporting findings based on calls for service data as opposed to recorded crime data. It has been suggested that this serves as a better measure of the lived reality of crime, as it is not subject to variation in police recording practices. Both calls for service and recorded crime data, however, are subject to reporting practices. Collectively, these are offered as key reasons by the Office of National Statistics as to why crime survey data offers a better measure of the underlying incidence of crime. Yet, from a policing perspective, crime survey data is not drawn from readily identifiable communities. It is not possible to use this data to directly inform policing practice at the local level. So, and in these terms, what can calls for service data tell us of inequalities in the exposure to crime? Here, and as an illustration, we examine the associations between the prevalence of violent crime as measured by the Crime Survey of England and Wales and both reported calls for service and recorded crime in Greater Manchester. We probe the distinction between these measures of crime according to the level of area deprivation. We do so for 1 year's worth of data. We would expect the prevalence of violent recorded crime to rise according to the level of deprivation. It does. However, the increase in the prevalence of recorded violent crime according to the level of deprivation is not linear. It rises more sharply as the level of deprivation rises. Thus, there are an average 8.5 violent recorded crimes in the most deprived neighbourhoods compared to 1.5 in the least deprived neighbourhoods, a ratio of 5.6 to 1. Turning to examine reported violent crimes, there are on average 39 reported violent crimes in the most deprived neighbourhoods compared to 7.2 in the least deprived neighbourhoods, a ratio of 5.4 to 1. Our analysis finds marginal but insignificant distinction in the relationship between reported and recorded violent crime according to the level of neighbourhood deprivation. In other words, and taking 1 year's data only, there is a proportionate relationship between reported and recorded crime by deprivation. And now, crime survey violent crimes. There are an average 81.1 violent crime survey crimes in the most deprived neighbourhoods compared to 8.7 in the least deprived neighbourhoods, a ratio of 9.4 to 1. What can we take from these findings? In terms of the decision to report violent crimes, i.e. the distinction between the crime survey and calls for service data, whilst we would expect the reporting of violent crime to be high due to its seriousness, it is clearly far lower in the most deprived neighbourhoods. We might expect this for a number of reasons, inclusive of the fear of reprisal and a lack of confidence in the police. These data therefore serve as a cue, but no more, for police forces working to improve confidence in policing in the most deprived neighbourhoods in their area of operation. This much is well known. However, the calls for service data offer more precise and spatially referenced guidance. That there are 39 violent crimes reported for every 8.5 recorded in deprived neighbourhoods leaves a sizable number potentially dissatisfied in the policing response to their call for service. Finally, it is worth reporting that we have extended our analysis and found that calls for service data to be less volatile than recorded crime data through time. In these terms, it provides a more reliable measure of the lived experience of crime. Recent years have witnessed growing concerns surrounding the rise of knife crime in England and Wales. This was specifically so in the period between 2015 and 2018. Yet, and in this period, the official count of knife crime, known as the annual data requirement in Greater Manchester, exhibited stability or even decline. This is indicated by the red line in the figure. In this period, concern about how knife crime was being counted in Greater Manchester led to the exclusion of its data by the Office of National Statistics from national crime records. To rectify this issue, Greater Manchester Police introduced a manual counting procedure in late 2017, leading to a significant rise in the count of knife crime. The knife crime trend becoming comparable to trends across other major metropolitan areas, excluding London. To validate the manual counting procedure and to establish a more effective counting mechanism, we developed a novel automated text mining approach to both quantify and support the qualification of knife crime offences. Our findings are represented by the green line. Our algorithm searched modus operandi text, i.e. instruments, means and weapons fields, as opposed to just the weapons field, the traditional field for knife crime counts. We searched approximately 1.8 million crime numbers spanning January 2013 to June 2019. It is interesting to note that one possible reason for the shortfall in knife crime recording prior to the introduction of a manual count was that at the beginning of 2015, Greater Manchester Police introduced mobile crime recording devices which may have disrupted capture of the weapons field data. Note the significant distinction between the findings of our algorithm and the official returns in the period 2015 to 2018. The key question, of course, is what underpins the rise in knife crime in this period. calculated as being a rise of 69%. Here, we extended our analysis to include possession offences, which are not part of the ADR, but part of the broader picture of knife crime. If we do so, the rise in knife crime in this period was one of 89%. We can draw a number of key observations from the data. In overview, the rise in knife crime comprised more of the same by knife crime type, though there were two exceptions to this where disproportionate increases were found. Possession offences increased by 129% and personal robbery offences by 135%. Further, 60% of knife crime occurred in the 20% most deprived neighbourhoods, a ratio that remains stable across the entire study period. Significantly, however, there has been an increase in younger age groups, especially those aged 15 to 18, and amongst Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. From a methodological standpoint, this research identifies the prospective value of deploying AI methodologies. From an empirical standpoint, the research identifies an increase in the absolute exposure of deprived neighbourhoods, of young people, and of BAME groups. In our final case study, we turn to a consideration of the extent to which mental ill health informs policing demand. Within the policing literatures and amongst police forces, there is a growing perception that a significant proportion of frontline resource is committed to dealing with incidents that entail an aspect of mental ill health. This is understood to be arising as part consequence of the austerity agenda, which has led to financial cuts across a range of public services. Yet, and reflecting that managing mental ill health is not a statutory responsibility of the police, in Greater Manchester, our case study area, only 2% of incidents were flagged as comprising an element of mental ill health. To explore incident data in greater detail, we developed a text mining approach to quantify mental ill health policing demand using a 6-year dataset of incident logs and to account for the deployment costs by linking this with GPS airwave deployment data. In overview, we found that 9 to 10% of all incidents or calls for service entail an aspect of mental ill health. Moreover, that 20% of all frontline resource is deployed to such incidents. Even so, this probably represents an underestimate given the lack of training officers hold in identifying mental ill health and the difficulty of doing so within an incident, i.e. some forms of mental ill health are difficult to identify. It is also an underestimate as this analysis does not take account of back office costs, the longer term consequence of managing such incidents. Nevertheless, this research shows the potential of mining wider policing data resources to identify the vulnerabilities of those with which the police are engaged. The volume of incidents and the resources committed to them highlight the need to improve policing capabilities and of the necessity of partnership working to manage mental ill health. At this point, I would like to draw this part of the presentation to a conclusion and thank you for listening.